¿Te doy la señal?
Dame un segundo. Se listo. Okay. Welcome everyone. Today we have a very special event, which is our Latin American Perspectives lecture. This is something that my name is Alberto Diaz-Calleros. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Studies. And I do want to spend a couple of minutes first explaining what the Latin American Perspectives lecture is, and then I will introduce our distinguished guest, Marie Paley. Kindly note that this is being live streamed and it will continue to be available for those of you who want to watch it after the event is done in our class YouTube events page. The Latin American Perspectives Journal was a journal established in 1971. Through the years as I was first came as director to the Center for Latin American Studies, I increasingly learned more about the journal and its importance for the Latin Americanist community. One phrase I want to point out at the very outset is something that Ron Chilcote told me in an email a few weeks ago, when he said that one of the objectives and the goals of this journal was to think about dissident paradigms of development. And I want to, highlight both the dissident and the paradigms. And one of the things that, I was not so aware is how important Stanford had been in the process that gave rise first to something called the Hispanic American Report, which was produced by students here at Bolivar House in the 1960s. It was probably the most important news digest reporting and finding out at the time, no internet, news of what was going on in Latin America. It would be picked up by the major news outlets in the country just to understand what was going on. And it was being done by students like any of you working feverishly in this same house, trying to get the latest reports and newspapers, actual paper newspapers would come into the center and people would read them and analyze what was going on. At the time, remember, this is the height of the Cold War. There's a lot of, student engagement and activity related to the events going on, particularly around the coup in Chile, Pinochet in 1973. There is a second story which I didn't know so well, but it has to do with the Latin American Studies Association, the whole effort even by the U.S., let's say the establishment of the U.S. to create learning of Latin America. So Title VI, which is a grant we have at this center from the Department of Education that allows us, for example, to have students who can learn indigenous languages and also less commonly taught languages through their scholarships. That comes from that era in which initially there was this sense that the U.S. was ill-prepared to the challenges of understanding the world around them. And as we think about it, all these institutions, the Latin American Research Review, which was initially a very, let's say, conventional journal, at least from the perspective of Latin American perspectives, all this learning started learning from Latin America, from the authors who were writing in Latin America and making an effort to really, be in a way less colonialist in the way all the scholarship was being done at the time. So I wanted to highlight this at the very beginning. We have had by now, this is our fifth Latin American Perspectives lecture. We're so grateful for the support from Latin American Perspectives, which is what makes it possible for us to have had Moira Fradinger, then Lynn Steven, then Pedro Eber, Aida Hernandez last year, and now we have Marie Paley. So let me just do highlight here, and I think Don will have something to say about this, but remind us that we are here in the land and territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We want to offer our gratitude for the land, for the water, for the air that surrounds us, and pay our respects to the present, to the future, and the past of the Ohlone peoples. The Ohlone peoples who continue to be here in their homelands. They were just, if any of you was able to see that, they had a very big exhibit in the Stanford Powwow last weekend, just to understand more about the Ohlone peoples who live amongst us. Marie Paley is a journalist. She's an author of a very highly praised book, Drug War Capitalism. Guerra, Neoliberal is the second book. She has also published some edited volume. I don't have the title here with me.
Organized Violence.
Organized Violence, that's right. That also was really, created a lot of attention among scholars, trying to link in a way things that you would think are, disparate within our concerns about the world today: extractivism, colonialism, capitalism, but then the drug war and the violence that has engulfed a lot of the countries in Latin America. She is the editor of Ojalá, a news media outlet in English and Spanish dedicated to critical coverage of Latin America. She has a master's in journalism from the University of British Columbia, Canada, and a PhD in sociology from the UAP, for the Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, and today she is our 2023 Latin American Perspectives Lecturer. Don, bienvenida.
Muchas gracias. Thank you everybody so much for being here. Especially want to thank Elizabeth for just amazing hospitality and organization and taking me to sniff all the flowers. That's how I've been keeping my cool. To Sara for all of her help with the logistics, and Megan, and of course Alberto, who also gave me a great tour of campus the other day. Also the Latin American perspectives. I have published a couple of articles. Actually, each of these books has its article version in Latin American perspectives if you want the Cliff's Notes. And I do want to acknowledge that we are on Ohlone territory and that a land acknowledgement isn't enough. As settlers and visitors on this land, which is unceded land, we need to keep pressuring for land back for the Ohlone people, and also to dismantle racism and colonialism here at Stanford. So I've been really happy to be here this week. I came on Sunday just to have a chance to kind of step back and process and try and transmit to you a bit of a sense of what's taking place right now in Mexico. And what I'm going to talk about today is towards my next book project. So it is a work in progress, and I very much welcome feedback and comments, trying out ideas, and I think that's partly why I'm so nervous. It's something I haven't been presenting on yet. But it's also something that I'm constantly chatting with and in discussion and interviewing people about inside Mexico. It's kind of like the topic that we're all just what's going on? What's the latest thing? How can we understand what's happening? And I think a lot of us are struggling a lot with trying to understand the present moment. So I am trained as a journalist and identify primarily as a journalist and a writer, but I also I was trained as a sociologist at the UAP. I've been in Mexico for just over 10 years, and most of that time I've been thinking about violence and militarized prohibition. And militarized prohibition, which is commonly known as the war on drugs, but that's how I've kind of taken to calling it in the past couple of years. It feels like the most accurate way of describing what the war on drugs is. So as I've explored in my work, militarized prohibition begets paramilitarism, or the creation of armed groups that are not formally paid by the state, but which work very closely with state forces, with certain facets of state forces. These groups are often referred to as drug cartels, but drug cartel is a reductive term, and it fails to account for the interaction between these groups, paramilitary groups, and state forces, as well as their role in social control and violence against communities, against migrants, against students, against activists, and so on. So when we talk about drug cartels, I feel like we're really making it very banal, instead of being more specific and using more exact terminology, which I think it's helpful to use the idea of paramilitary. So my first book, Drug War Capitalism, talks about this, and we have a ton of copies, which I think people can take home. So I'm not going to go back into that work. Drug War Capitalism did come out 10 years ago, and it's something that I keep building on. It's definitely continuing to influence the current work. What I try to do in Drug War Capitalism is basically trace the impact of the U.S.-backed militarization of prohibition from Plan Colombia in Colombia, which starts in the year 2000, through the Merida Initiative in Mexico and Central America, basically trying to situate the violence in the context of global capitalism, consider the territories where it's taking place, consider resistance and social movements as we talk about something that's so often presented as something separate and exotic and that's happening between a bunch of greedy men and doesn't impact society somehow. So the main argument of drug war capitalism is that the drug war is political. It's highly political. It's not something that's not political. And the violence that it produces can be channeled into social control and control of dissent. So just before drug war capitalism came out, it came out in November of 2014, a couple months before I started the PhD in Puebla. And as folks will remember, and I'm sure, and I hope this is something that you're actively still talking about and remembering in this space, it was in September of 2014 that the 43 students from Ayotzinapa were disappeared, right, on September 26, 2014, in Iguala, Guerrero. And 6 people were killed that night. I know you recently had John Gibler here. He's done some excellent work through using oral history and testimony of survivors and eyewitnesses to recreate what took place that night. But it was a night of horror. I'm sure he talked about it, right? The students running, fleeing for their lives, hiding in people's front yards. And the 43 students who were disappeared were last seen under arrest and being put into patrol cars belonging to municipal police officers in Iguala. And so there's no way to talk about violence in Mexico, or the army in Mexico for that matter, without talking about Ayotzinapa. The disappearance of the 43 students in Ayotzinapa changed the political landscape in Mexico. So though outrage was slow to build, it didn't happen right away. It wasn't the next day that people were protesting, but by mid-October, massive protests were taking place throughout Mexico, around the world. One of the key rallying cries was "Fue el Estado," it was the state, and that's something that people are still coming back to, right? And the reason that I mentioned my starting a PhD right before that took place was that I got to be inside a public university in Mexico in that context, which was a context of a huge amount of organizing. So I got to learn from that communal response where, like, every single day what we were doing was, what do we do today? How do we protest today? What are our banners going to say? Where are we going to go? Who are we going to target? What's going to be our approach today? Because it was like a period of so much organizing in Mexico. It was just it felt like an unbelievable thing had happened. 43 students had just vanished and nobody knew what was happening, right? Supposedly, according to the officials. I like to say Ayotzinapa is the only thing that's exceptional about it is the amount that we know about it. It's actually not that exceptional in terms of there have been other cases of mass disappearances, of massacres and so on that haven't transcended in the same way. But the amount that we know about what took place that night and the level of protest that it generated was truly unprecedented. So I had gone into the PhD with a project to look at clandestine mass graves, and when I first started the PhD, people were like, why are you looking at Narcos? Like, what's so interesting about that? Like, just those first couple months, and then after Ayotzinapa, people were like, oh, that's actually probably a good idea. Like, maybe it's worthwhile. Maybe there is a way to study from the left, from a progressive position, what's taking place with the violence, with the narco-trafficking, with the militarization in Mexico. So there was a shift in my own work. And my own work also shifted for another reason. So there had been disappearances in Mexico historically. Over 500 people were disappeared in Guerrero, mostly in Guerrero, not only, but in the 1970s. And this is in the context of the Cold War, and it links up quite evenly with the way military juntas were disappearing people in the Southern Cone, Central America, etc. So there was an existing movement for the disappeared, but by the time Ayotzinapa happened, disappearance had been growing in Mexico in a really significant way, but it hadn't been politicized, and it hadn't really become something that people were protesting about, hadn't really become something that people were mobilizing around. It was still perceived, and I have academics who I spoke with about my own work around this time just going like, well, it's just narcos disappearing each other, right? Or andaban algo, right? Which is your classic, that person who was disappeared was involved. So sort of criminalization not only of the person conducting the disappearance as, oh, it's a cartel member, or it's a bad guy clearly disappearing another bad guy, right? This very simplistic very depoliticizing way of thinking about what was taking place in Mexico. Which contrasts with the history of disappearance that comes from the 1970s, comes out of struggle, that whole Cold War context. It made the politicization of disappearance a lot easier for family members. It's like our family members were activists, they were guerrillas, they were part of union movements, they were building a better future, they were fighting for something, and they were disappeared. So the political context by 2014 was very, very different. And this new wave of disappearances that was underway was definitely a product of the militarization connected to the drug war, which started December 2006, right? So we go back in time a little bit. So it had already been 8 years of war and disappearance by the time the 43 students were disappeared. Felipe Calderón, right? So within 10 days in office, he started Operación Conjunto Michoacán, which was to send soldiers and federal police officers into the state of Michoacán. But the discourse then, and the discourse really until Ayotzinapa, that was very a barrage all the time, was that perpetrators were members of drug cartels and victims were involved in trafficking. And you just got told that over and over and over again. Even if the victims were adolescent teenagers at a birthday party, like in Villas de Salvar Juárez. And they tried to do that with Ayotzinapa at the beginning. They tried to lean back on all their familiar tools of just saying oh, those kids must have been traffickers. But it didn't work. It didn't work in 2014. The discourse started to fall apart. Fue el Estado was very effective at penetrating the way people understood what took place in Ayotzinapa. The government tried to make its verdad histórica and say this is our version of what happened. Totally fell apart. Today, that discourse is in tatters. So the state is still trying to use a discourse of the guilty, the bad are being disappeared, but there's 500,000 direct victims at this point of the violence in Mexico. Over 400,000 folks been killed by homicide since 2006, and over 112,000 disappeared. So there had already been mass graves appearing in Mexico in the 2010s, before Ayotzinapa, but it was the searches that took place after Ayotzinapa that really also changed the course of history, and it changed the course of my own doctoral work as well, which was that the family members of the students and community police started going out and looking for the 43 students in the hills around Iguala, beautiful green tropical hills, and finding all these graves, but then they weren't the students. But the way we were already mobilizing, people were so active, people were so upset, there was so much rabia, that it was just more anger. Well, then if it's not students, who is it? You must answer for this, right? And what that created was a movement of searchers. So family groups who had been previously organizing around their own disappeared started taking that cue from the searchers who were going out and looking for human remains in Iguala and doing their own searches. Right now, I think we can estimate about 200 different search groups throughout Mexico. They're self-organized. They're organized by the families themselves. Over 17 members of these search groups have been murdered in the past few years. A woman was just murdered just before Mother's Day, the week before Mother's Day in Guanajuato, but these women are constantly under attack. This is Marie Herrera. She has 4 children, 4 sons who are disappeared, 4. And so she's organized the Familiares en Búsqueda María Herrera, which is one of the groups that helps articulate many of the other family groups. I did my doctoral work with Grupo Vida, which is Víctimas por Nuestros Derechos en Acción in Torreón, Coahuila, which was a really wonderful, really painful experience. And honestly, it was for me, the last 10 years in Mexico have just been a lot of pain, right? Being very close to pain, trauma, all of the kinds of loss that people experience when they're experiencing extreme violence, the stigma, the economic hardships, etc. And these are avoidable tragedies. This war it doesn't need to be happening. There is no reason for the drug war to be taking place the way it is. And I have to say I've learned so much from being able to be in community with people. I've met Maria a couple times. She's amazing. So brave, so wise, just maybe could give the next Latin American Perspectives lecture. These are folks who really understand the terrain. They understand what's happening with criminal groups in the state better than anyone else. but the sadness is just like the only thing they want is to find their loved ones, right? So everything else that's happening around the edges is all kind of doesn't matter. But yeah, I think for me, one of the things about witnessing and writing about and accompanying these processes is kind of a sense that like things couldn't get worse. Like I really thought, like if you would have asked me like 3 years ago if things could get worse, I'd be like, no, we're at the bottom. Like this is horrible, right? You can see here, I just wanted to show, just because visually it's quite striking, just how homicide rates have spiked since the war on drugs was declared. And this is important because the war on drugs was not a response to rising homicides. It was the thing that created the problem. And it didn't become a campaign issue until 2012. It was not a campaign issue in 2006. It was an imposed war, and it was imposed largely by the United States government. And this is a kind of an imperfect graph, but we can see again, just desaparecidos. This is like all of the historic numbers. And then in the, many years, like decades, until 2006, you had like, double-digit number of people disappeared, which is a problem, right? But then suddenly you get into triple, quadruple, 5-digit numbers, and clearly this is again connected to the same impulse at the beginning of the war on drugs. So just this sense like, this cannot get worse. And then guess what? Okay, so that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. It's this sinking sense that I'm sharing with you and that I'm sharing with colleagues, and that we're constantly just like, is this even possible? Is this getting worse? Is the future a lot cloudier than the present? And it feels like it is. And I know like a lot of us in this room probably like share the kind of doomsday scroll, like climate change, like billionaires, COVID, like everything feels like it's getting worse a lot of the time. There's also the Republicans like launching like this, like every once in a while they'll be like, well, we should bomb Mexico, like that thing kind of lurking there, but like hopefully that never happens. But like there's these things going like, oh yeah, things could get so much worse, right? But what is specifically concerning in Mexico today is the expanded role of the armed forces and the impacts that this could have for our shared future. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of this talk talking about. So folks here know that the 20th century in Mexico is quite different than it was elsewhere in Latin America, right? Mexican Revolution really set things apart. You had serious amount of land redistribution. You had the nationalization of the oil company. You had a massive state apparatus created and a party apparatus which really set Mexico on its own path. The one-party system under the PRI was founded in the 1940s, and the party was run by generals until the mid-50s. And the last two presidents who were military generals in Mexico is Lázaro Cárdenas and Manuel Ávila Camacho. They actually reduced the army's power, so they came to power at a time when there were still factions fighting within the army. And in their period, it sort of like get rid of those factions, exile or destroy anyone who continues to compete within the army, and then shrink it because they knew its power was too great. And then the first civilian president of Mexico was Miguel Alemán. He took office in 1946, and he established Mexico's first modern post-revolutionary civilian military pact. And this is basically the creation of the sort of apparatus of what the army has outside of its traditional mandate of policing, basically, but like territorial control. So you have the creation of Banquercito, which is the army's bank, the creation of the military pension system, so guarantee that serving in the army would be enough to provide for you and potentially your family into the future, and the creation of the military industry, which is now largely based in Puebla. So this is making uniforms, boots, bullets. They make a lot of guns. They make armored vehicles, etc. And it was also the period in which the army was changed from Ejército Nacional to Ejército Mexicano. So this is, I'm conceiving of this as the initial military pact. And it was brokered at a time when pre-hegemony was basically being set up. And what's so interesting to me is that it actually outlasted the hegemony of the PRI. So, PRI hegemony starts to collapse in the 1990s, eventually lose the presidency in 2000. And the military pact, the argument that I'm making here that I'd like to make is that it's currently being reset. There's a new military pact that is taking hold right now in Mexico, but it lasted for a long time, a very long time. Part of the military pact basically was also that the army would get a lot of autonomy in exchange for total loyalty to the president. And this was part of the way of guaranteeing the political system and hegemony of the PRI. We also saw from the very beginning, actually from Valdés's term in office, which was 1946 to 1952, the army participating in policing right away. So this was not something that came later. Over the span of Alemán's sexenio, the army broke strikes, worked as scabs, replacing oil workers, railroad workers, mine workers, and telephone workers, sometimes on multiple occasions. So you had the army doing very political work, policing work right from the beginning of the military pact. So World War II is really important, and this, Alemán's also in power at the tail end of World War II, but it's really important because it brings the US and the Mexican army together for the first time. These are two forces that had been antagonistic, and if we looked at 19th century history in Mexico, we know that the US invaded multiple times, etc., right? So this is a previously very unpopular idea, the Mexican army collaborating in any way or having relationships with the US army. In fact, they were much closer to the French army. And then during World War II, that changed. That changed dramatically. Lázaro Cárdenas became defense minister after he was president. And he led the Mexican army through the Second World War period. Officials from Mexico began to travel to the United States for training. And the Mexican army began to get a lot of new weapons, aircraft, vehicles from the United States during this period. So this is a big shift, and this is, I think, really important in terms of how we understand the history of the Mexican army. Almost as soon as World War II ends, Mexican police and soldiers start overseeing the destruction of illicit crops. So they begin their prohibition mandate, and this is often done with U.S. support. So one of the ways that U.S. support is channeled to the Mexican military after the Second World War is anti-narcotics work. I found this pretty classic photo, and believe it or not, they're still doing something fairly similar today. Like, they're not using sticks, they use chemicals now. This is crop destruction, manual crop destruction or eradication, right, of opium crops. And I think it's important to just bring up this history because the Mexican army has been policing narcotics for over 70 years. Like, when I think about it, I'm just like, there's nothing new under the sun. Like, this is what the Mexican army knows how to do. This is what they've been doing in their entire sort of post-World War II modern identity as a force. It's basically the raison d'etre. And I want to touch on prohibition just for a second because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about prohibition. Prohibition is not a hands-off policy by which states lose control over a market of illegal narcotics and are scrambling to figure out what to do. Prohibition is an active strategy of management by which, when enforcement is deemed a priority, the state repressive apparatus has an active role in policing prohibited substances. It's active management of prohibited substances using military forces. And the state does this not only through dissuasive measures, but also by determining which groups can import, produce, move, and export illicit substances and where. So the army is essentially organizing from the beginning the trafficking, the production of narcotics inside of Mexico. And we see this very clearly when we look at the history of the Federal Security Directorate, the FES, which was soldiers, and, so many testimonies all the way up to the present day of Cienfuegos, but like almost every sexenio, there's some kind of general who's like being hung out to dry because it turns out he's actually organizing drug trafficking. And we can see this especially since Plan Condor, right? 1975, that's when this became a real increasing priority for the United States, and Plan Condor was really, really important. And I think one of the things I just want to kind of touch on in terms of the management of prohibition by the military is the bleed. between managing prohibition and repressing social movements. This is something that we've seen since the beginning. Academics like Alexandra Viña, de la Cedillo have documented this quite carefully, especially in Guerrero in the 1970s. So the troops that are supposedly doing the crop destruction are also killing activists, killing organizers, the same people, the same ones. So internal policing and overseeing narcotics production have been a central role played by the Mexican army, part of the Pacto Militar, obviously not the spoken about part, and that the control of prohibited substances and the repression of social movements really goes hand in hand, to say that, through the present day. There's some amazing photos online of 1968, Tlatelolco, really powerful. State repression in Mexico grew through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. There were massacres, but there was also selective repression against activists, unionists, and so on. Unlike other countries in Central America, South America, Mexico did not experience military rule, which leads to a certain amount of exceptionalism to this day. You know, our army is good. We did not have a general in power. And also, some have argued that it leads to a very high level of trust among Mexicans of the armed forces that continue to pull among the most trusted institutions in the country. In the 1980s and 1990s, the army was increasingly used in a policing role. And I think it's important to connect this policing role as connected to the imposition of neoliberalism in Mexico in the 1980s. 1990s, scholars talk about how neoliberalism in Mexico was among the most profound such processes anywhere in the world. You had over 1,000 public companies that were privatized, public sector was gutted, constitutional law from the revolution protecting communal land was rolled back. And it's important to note as well, which I feel like often falls off the radar when people, especially in the US, talk about neoliberalism. It doesn't mean that the state shrinks. What we saw in Mexico was that the repressive part of the state grew during neoliberalism. So Mexico's army grew by a quarter in the 1990s. The number of officers under Cedillo increased fourfold. And Cedillo really emphasized, Ernesto Cedillo really emphasized organized crime as the key threat to Mexico. And throughout this whole period in Mexican history, always in the 90s and today, people have organized for what is theirs. If people have patrimonio, if they have land, it's because they fought for it. Because the state-making process in Mexico has been one of constant despojo. So people organizing for their land rights, for their social, economic rights, often at extremely high costs. And, you know, we had in the 1990s, most famously, the Zapatista uprising, which brought the attention of the world to the ongoing oppression of indigenous people in Mexico. As president, Carlos Salinas sent the military in to repress the Zapatistas. At the same time, he was trying to keep his sort of cosmopolitan, modern Harvard image on the international scene alive. So one thing that happened right after the Zapatista uprising, which is kind of, I feel like, a little bit forgotten in the history, is that Salinas introduced a really comprehensive electoral reform. And that was a way to bring all of the parties who could have split at that moment, and there was a lot happening with the left in that time, bring all the parties to the table and say, okay, fair elections. And that was a big part of what led to the eventual downfall of the PRI party, was the electoral reform that took place in 1994. So the end of the 20th century, you know, 1999, you're going to campaigns for the big election in 2000. The PRD party, the Party of the Democratic Revolution, actually did call for reforms to the military within the context of what it called the democratic reform of the state. And the PRD's founding documents, which were written in 1999, state, and I quote, "The only objective of the armed forces will be the preservation of the integrity and the security of the nation, and they will never be used to carry out policing or judicial functions." So sort of progressive position on like state reform being necessary to transition to democracy, including the army, and that the army cannot be a police. It cannot serve as a police force within a democracy. In the words of one analyst, the period before the 2000 elections was, I quote, "the first time a political party had openly criticized the military," unquote, in nearly 80 years. So it was, they would say you can't criticize the president, the military, or Guadalupe. There were like things that you couldn't mention, you couldn't say, that no journalist would write about. Fox himself, Vicente Fox from the PAN party, who was elected in 2000, he also promised to reform the military, but if you look back over that time, he actually promised everything. I mean, his campaign was just vote for me, I'll do whatever, right? Like, I will do everything good and right, and I'll do things for the left, and I'll do things for the right. But he did have, as well, a discourse about there needing to be a truth commission connected to what took place in Guerrero, etc., but also reforms to the army, and all that talk just kind of disappeared in the 6-month period that he was president-elect. The talk about the army, there was a sort of a half-hearted attempt at doing a little bit of truth commission, but not very much. So in the words of Javier Trevino Rangel, the army was, and I quote, incorporated intact into the democratic regime and continued working with exactly the same rules, structure, and laws it did during the authoritarian era. So I want to touch briefly on the idea of what it means for the military to be under democratic control. So political scientist Jorge Diaz surveys the literature, and he basically proposes 3 ways that we can understand, 3 things that are necessary for civilians in a democratic society to control the military. 1, institutional subordination of generals and troops, the army and the navy, to the democratic government. 2, elected civilians overseeing and formulating defense policy, military education, defense budgets, and missions. And 3, that soldiers be subject to the rule of law. So, this is probably really obvious, but none of these 3 conditions exist in Mexico. They didn't exist in the 20th century, they don't exist today. The minister of the army and the minister of the navy are an admiral and a general named by the president, and the ministries are run and staffed mostly by soldiers. The armed forces have near total control over their finances, so basically Congress will decide how much they get. Or that was the system in the old Pacto Militar. Now it's going to be a little bit different, but Congress would decide how much the armed forces would get, and they alone would decide how it was spent. And the army, of course, continues to run its own court and prison system, as does the navy, and this is explored in a book called La Tropa, which I highly recommend, by Daniel Arrea and Pablo Ferri, which came out a couple of years ago. So after Fox, we have Felipe Calderón, also from the PAN, coming to power in 2006. He launches the drug war as we now know it. And again, my first book focuses on this period, on how the violence produced by the war on drugs is instrumental in guaranteeing the expansion of capitalism, the expansion of extractivism, social control of migrants. And another thing I look at in drug war capitalism is the role of U.S. financing for this militarization, which is not minor. It's pretty major. Enrique Peña Nieto is the next president to take office, and this is the swing back to the PRI that happened in 2012. And of course, it was during Peña Nieto's presidency that the 43 students were disappeared. So I want to come back to Ayotzinapa again, because it's not something to mention once. It's really, I think, fundamental in understanding violence and state in Mexico. This is obviously AMLO, and you can see a couple other the regular suspects, Encinas there, and Carla Quintana, who is the head of the Comisión Nacional de Búsqueda, posing with the family members of the 43. This photo was taken in 2019. And I show it because I think it's important to really emphasize that Ayotzinapa was actually really important in AMLO's campaign. He promised justice. He promised that those families would get justice. He promised that there would be a change. He promised that he would reject the old system of violence in Mexico. And he was shoulder to shoulder with the family members of the 43 from shortly after the disappearance took place, and I think he still would like to be, but I don't think he can get this many of them together anymore. So historically there is some ambiguity, and there's people that argue that actually while López Obrador was like a lot more ambiguous about how he was going to deal with the military, and if you read this passage of his book, blah, 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 you'll see that he's actually always been pro-military, but he did clearly promise that once he was in office, he was going to stand up a civilian National Guard and that he was going to end the war on drugs. So, of course, he's elected by a landslide. People are tired. People want something else. He's got a new party. He's presenting a new discourse. He's promising change, transformation, la cuarta transformación, as I'm sure you're all tired of hearing. His vision was sweeping. It was really structural transformation. Like, even, like, cynical, like, old leftists were like, yeah, I voted for him. Yeah. You know, I thought it was gonna, you know, and people love AMLO, and they still love AMLO. A lot of people do. But it's interesting because if you can see the parallels with Fox, during the 6 months he's president-elect, his tone starts to change on the military. So within a month of his election, he says, I quote, "We can't stop using the Army and the Marines to guarantee public security." So it's already starting to move, and it's so interesting because the Mexican press says that he's hitting up against reality. No está topando con la realidad. It's like, nice promises you made, right? But the reality is otherwise, and the reality is Sedena, the Ministry of Defense, actually has a lot of power over what takes place in Mexico. In November of 2018, his team released the National Plan for Peace and Security, and they promised to end the drug war, and a lot of it does track with sort of campaign promises, but again states that it would be a disaster to relieve the armed forces of their current role in public security, and that's the first time we get the suggestion the National Guard is actually going to be under Army control. On his first day in office, he creates a new truth commission for Ayotzinapa, and he is a very busy guy. Like, if I think of people who are busy, AMLO is the busiest person I can imagine, right? But he's really, really busy in those first few months in office. So first he says the war in Mexico is over. This is in January of 2019. He declares the war on drugs over. And then 2 months later, he declares neoliberalism over. So he's also making these really big statements, and you know, people are going, okay, like, end it then, right? Like, there's a word and action situation here. But weirdly and frustratingly, a lot of people around the world and internationally who really want to believe in something, they start saying things like, neoliberalism is over in Mexico. Okay, well, I don't know. Haven't seen it yet. But so he's still very progressive on the words, but the dealings with the army are already telling us that something else is actually happening. So I think that the activity of the army in Mexico today is unprecedented for two reasons. I'm calling it a new Pacto Cívico-Militar. First is the size of the force, their budget, and the territorial control, and I'll show you a couple slides on that in a second. And the second is the expansion of their field of action. So it's not just the military industry and Majercito anymore. Now they're building critical logistical infrastructure, which they are expected to operate in perpetuity. We're talking about trains, airports, ports, customs houses, etc. The war on drugs didn't end. I don't know, spoiler alert. Like, he said it was over, but from basically the beginning, so from 2019, fentanyl came on the scene, and it was like, well, actually, you know what? We gotta deal with fentanyl, so we gotta keep the army on the war on drugs. But if you look at the Army's own documentation, they also are reporting that they're seizing marijuana, that they're seizing methamphetamines, that they're seizing They never stopped. They never stopped because it's what they best know how to do. It's what the Army best knows how to do in Mexico. So you have them still participating in the control of narcotics, and, you know, destroying a laboratory is probably the most harmless thing they can do. They're also detaining people, and they're also killing people or shooting people who they suspect of being traffickers, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And again, fentanyl has really kind of been like a bellows that has like re-stoked the fire, right, of the drumbeat of the war on drugs. And, you know, the U.S. has a lot to do with that. Like, the Justice Department is now blaming the overdose crisis in the U.S. on Mexican cartels, right? So therefore, Mexico has to go even harder on the cartels than they were before. People who are advocating for a different strategy started to kind of like walk things back. No, yes, you know, we can talk about maybe legalizing, maybe marijuana, but fentanyl must be attacked with all of our force, etc. And of course, they've continued on with the internal policing role. We know this in part because of the leaks obtained by the Guacamaya hacking collective that show that the Army has never stopped spying. on activists, on dissidents, on feminists, etc. So the National Guard was stood up, and it was stood up under army control. So it wasn't a civilian force, and we were told at the beginning it was going to eventually transition back to a civilian force. The Supreme Court has now said that it has to go back to civilian leadership. But for the moment, just basically López Obrador and all of the parties, like there's no anti-militarist force in Mexican politics, have avalado or voted to have a militarized National Guard, and that's been a huge windfall. That's been a huge windfall in terms of the budget that is going to Sedena. So here you can just see, you probably can't see it that well, but basically military budgets have doubled in Mexico since 2008. Sedena is the Ministry of Defense and Semar is the Marines. But again, just especially in the last couple of years, the National Guard has probably been the most significant, and the size of these forces has also grown significantly. So at the beginning of May, the total size of the Army, Air Force, Marines, and National Guard was around 350,000. Over 75% of them, or just over 190,000, were deployed inside of Mexico. And this is something I feel like people who don't go to Mexico, they maybe don't understand. Like, the Mexican Army is not deployed to Iraq. The Mexican Army is deployed inside of Mexico, and their enemies are Mexican people, right? So of the current force, about 97,000 are soldiers, so army soldiers wearing army uniforms. And I want to compare that just because of how criticism gets distorted over the years and works, but like during Calderón's term, there was 37,000 soldiers deployed in Mexico. During Peña Nieto's term, it was around 50,000. So, and now we're talking about 97,000, and that's just soldiers. So we're talking about, it's not that he changed what the army is doing in Mexico. He helped facilitate the deployment of even more soldiers inside the country. And these are the slides that I really wanted to show you guys, because when I saw them, I was just like, what? Okay, so this is from the defense minister's presentation in the Mañanera. They speak every second Tuesday, the Minister of Defense and the Minister of the Marines. So this is just National Guard. This is just National Guard, so it's 107,000 plus elementos that are deployed throughout the country. Next slide. This is National Guard and Army as deployed currently throughout Mexico. This is National Guard, Army, and Marines as deployed throughout Mexico. And then this one just like head exploding, right? This is National Guard, Army, Marines, and the Air Force as deployed throughout Mexico. This is how they're presenting themselves and what they're doing to the people of Mexico. It's pretty intense, right? Like there is not much going on outside of those circles. And a real concentration in central Mexico, obviously, but you can also see kind of like certain buildups in border areas and also the Yucatan Peninsula, which I'll touch on in just a moment. So, some scholars and some pundits and columnists and whatever from different ideologies, they'll debate like the army's presence, and they'll say, oh, it's a group, it's controlled by organized crime, there's no state presence, etc., or suggest that non-state groups actually have better, more modern weapons than the army. And I think these graphs just really, without a doubt, show that the strongest, largest fighting force in Mexico is the Mexican army. There is no doubt about that. And I think it's important to just like have that in mind, understand that. The Mexican army isn't like a tiny little thing that's fighting, the firepower that no one else had. Like, they have very modern weapons, and they have hundreds of thousands of elements. Another piece of this is that soldiers are currently building 600 new bases, 600 new National Guard bases around the country. 3 of them are going to be in Mexico City. But so you're also seeing, like, and this is more for geographers in the room, but like, the actual creation of that hard, fast infrastructure of military bases throughout the territory. New military bases in addition to what's already there. And right now, National Guards all over the place, right? So they're policing migration. It's part of their mandate is to detain migrants. But they're also on the metro, right? They're policing the metro lines, and this is actually quite political. We can talk about that a little bit if people want. And the army itself is also policing migrants, and this is something that historically hasn't been part of their mandate. So the territorial control on its own would be like, this is bad, this is scary, this is not great. But it's kind of the second part of what feels unprecedented about the new military pact that is also like cause for a lot of concern. And this has to do with infrastructure, right? So like I mentioned, basically since 2019, because no one saw this coming, state-run mega projects are being handed to the army to build and to operate in perpetuity. This is AMLO addressing soldiers who are building the Tren Maya, or I saw it called recently, the army train. This opens up new revenue sources for the armed forces, which, as mentioned, are not under democratic or civilian control. There's really no way to hold them accountable or to even see the records, especially with the potential destruction of the Freedom of Information Office, which seems imminent. And this militarization of critical infrastructure is being carried out by a left-wing government, and it's being presented as a means through which nationalization can happen today. So the argument that AMLO makes is that the armed forces are the only institution inside of Mexico that will be able to withstand future pressure to privatize, and therefore they should be the ones charged with building new infrastructure and operating new state-run infrastructure. So Mexico's Secretary of Defense now controls and operates 6 new public state-owned companies. And these companies right now are building airports in Chetumal and Tulum in Quintana Roo. They're still building the International Airport in Mexico City, which is a major airport, as well as a new airport in Palenque, Chiapas. Another one of these companies is building the Tren Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula. And they're also going to be providing complementary services, including running hotels and so on. So the Army is building, if you can see where the 2 lines join there, that's basically Cancun. The Army is building the line from Cancun south and also the line that goes through Chetumal. And this is all new train tracks. There's no previous train tracks there. And one thing I think that's important, I like this map because where it's showing us like the beige color, the kind of khaki green color, it says here propiedad social. That's communal land. So this is communal land owned by Mayas, Mayan people who fought for every single thing they have and that they share through a war with the Mexican state that lasted until the early 19th century. But you can see that this mega project is really interrupting and cutting through a lot of communally owned property. And so along the southern line and the line from Cancun to Chetumal, I can't remember the number, but there's a bunch of hotels that are going to be run by the Army. They're proposing to build like sort of mega complexes with malls and stuff around each station. And they're talking about a reconversion of the Yucatan Peninsula in terms of land ownership as well. So all new revenue streams for the Army. And I just want to share the name of the 6th group that they've created, the 6th company that has been created for the Army, which is the holding company that owns all the other ones. It's called the Olmeca Maya Mexica Airport Train and Auxiliary Services Group. So they're just really going for it, you know. It's very blatant and it's being celebrated on a regular basis by politicians and by civilians. I mean, that's the thing about it. This photo always just makes me like alucinar. This is the day that the Felipe Ángeles Airport was opened. March 21st of last year, and just, one of the women that went to the opening was taking her selfie with the soldiers, as one does, I guess. The Army's also building nearly 3,000 new branches of the Banco del Bienestar, controlling all of Mexico's customs offices. So next time you cross on the land border from the U.S. into Mexico, if you te toca revisión, it will be a soldier. Will be doing that. And then the Secretary of the Marines, which is a much smaller force, very, very close to the United States government and to the U.S. Marines, much closer in terms of intelligence sharing and so on, are not kind of being left out of the deal. They took over the merchant marines, and they now also run all of Mexico's ports. As well, the Marines have been promised a stake in running 2 airports in Sonora State, and they've been promised a key role in the building and running of the Corredor Transísmico, which is supposed to run from Veracruz, Coatzacoalcos, through the Istmo of Tehuantepec, out the other side. It's like a dry canal with mega projects on both sides, and connected to refineries and like zona libres and all your regular stuff that we normally see on the north border. Now in this majority indigenous part of Mexico as well, and highly communal land. So the Marines have been promised a key role, and this is likely to be actually a central project of the next sexennial. It's kind of getting off the ground right now, but it's not going to be finished by the time they'll leave. So this is just like a partial snapshot. I could go on, and I really didn't want to make this talk like a laundry list of things, but this just kind of gives an idea of this sort of slide of the army into managing civilian affairs. And I wanted to kind of go over this because we're not used to talking about it, and we're all trying to figure out like how best to understand what's going on. And so I think we need to talk and think about military business, and this is based on research globally, not just with the Mexican military. There's different ways that soldiers and armies are involved in business. One is through the participation as individuals, like doing business on the side. Another is institutional participation by the army in state infrastructure projects, etc., which we're increasingly seeing in Mexico. And again, it's having to do with rent seeking. And it's not just about rent seeking from consumers or tourists or whatever, but also seeking new kinds of contracts from the Mexican government that they simply wouldn't have had a chance to qualify for previously. But then another part of military business, and this is actually something that's like very accepted in the literature, is that they do illicit business, is that the army is involved in illegal economies. And this is proven over and over again in all different places. This is related to cash economy. In the case of Mexico, it would be connected to narcotics, obviously. But I think one of the other things to keep in mind is that the new responsibilities of the army with regards to critical infrastructure is likely to increase their ability to influence and oversee and profit from the export and transport of narcotics. Like if you're running the ports, if you're running the airports, helps. So 20 years ago, military involvement in business was basically declining because a lot of the juntas in the South, they were heavily involved in running all different corporations, and it kind of started to peter out, except for in Chile. And today, Mexico is really leading the charge in the opposite direction. It's really reinvesting in the idea that the military should be involved in all kinds of parts and facets of the state. And we're freaked out. I think a lot of us in Mexico who are following what's happening, it feels like every week there's some kind of new announcement of a military company or a new tax, or for example, like a new airline that they're supposed to get. But like I'll interview activists all the time, and they'll just be like, I feel like we don't really understand what this is going to mean. Like, and that feels like the sentiment. And so this is kind of the project that I'm hoping to work on for the next year or so. But it is like challenging when you're in the moment to be like, what's the greater meaning here, right? Historically, armies in Latin America have not been very competent administrators. So we can certainly expect graft, we can expect corruption, we can expect lack of transparency, lack of accountability. But to be honest, all of that feels pretty secondary when I think through like what the other concern is, which is the insertion of hundreds of thousands of soldiers into everyday life who have been trained to perceive an enemy within the Mexican people. And, you know, as people mobilize in Mexico, which they constantly do and constantly are in many ways, for their land, for their territory, their patrimonio, their loved ones, will increasingly be facing the army. So there's a scholar named Alejandro Lerch, and he writes that, quote, states were never in a position to monopolize crime, but rather instrumentalized some of this crime to build and support security apparatuses aimed at a particular alienated social class. And he's traced this phenomenon through the history of Mexico. And right now it feels like we're really poised for this to become even more daunting. I'm going to close just by mentioning that, I think one way of approaching what's going to happen right now is to go and I've heard people say this, we'll know what it means when there's a right-wing government, right? Then when the right-wing government starts repressing, using the soldiers to repress, then we'll really see the fallout from this. And then there's another suggestion, which I also think is quite naive, to say we'll see what this really means, what this really does when there's a big uprising, right? It's quashed by soldiers. Then we'll really. But I think I've got, if possible, an even more pessimistic perspective, which is that we've already seen what the Army and the Marines are capable of. And we've seen it recently, we've seen it in history, we saw it in Tlatelolco, we saw it in Corpus Christi, we saw it in Guerrero in the 70s. I did some reporting in 2018 when the Marines forcibly disappeared over 50 people in the city of Nuevo Laredo on the border across from Laredo, Texas. And in the same city, this photo is taken in Nuevo Laredo in February. Because right now the Army's basically taken over Nuevo Laredo, which is the most important point of entry in terms of commerce between the US and Mexico. The Army has essentially taken it over, and there's been just a series of disasters, including a massacre of 5 young men in February. And after this massacre took place, the neighbors went out. And there's photos that almost bring up the Zapatista woman pushing the soldier. There's photo of woman also pushing the soldier, which I didn't find. But neighbors just going out and being what are you doing? You're killing our children. And this is how the Army's responding, right? So no further people were killed, but this was the Army, and their justification was basically, well, their music was really loud and we thought they were drug dealers. So we opened fire on their vehicle. Again, Nuevo Laredo is kind of on the front edge of dystopia in terms of what it's like to live under Army occupation in Mexico right now. There's other really well-known Army massacres, Atlaya in Mexico State, the Caso Alvarado, which is really important, in Chihuahua, where 3 people were disappeared by soldiers. But Iguala, again, and I'm going to close on Ayotzinapa. We know that the Army, and this is because of the independent group of experts and the state investigation, we know that the Army was spying on the students. We know that the Army had classified the students as a security threat on the same level as drug cartels. We know that one of the disappeared students was actually an active duty soldier, and they let him disappear. We know that officials visited multiple sites while the events were taking place and were circulating around that night and basically overseeing what was taking place. And as I mentioned, López Obrador campaigned on justice, right, for the 43 and was elected in part on that promise. And unfortunately, what we've seen his government do is rush the investigation. We've seen new evidence that the Army and the Marines tampered with the basurero in Cocula, so the actual scene of potentially of one of the crimes. We've watched generals continue to refuse to hand over information about what took place that night. They still haven't given all the files. We've seen trusted figures in AMLO's government, like Encinas, who's quite trusted and quite respected, put out a report with fake information in it, but also put that report out without having the family members participating in the process. And we also see the men named as participants in the cover-up of Ayotzinapa, in the government's own documents, saying these guys participated in the cover-up of what took place after Ayotzinapa, during Ayotzinapa, continue to collect hefty pensions, continue to enjoy really good jobs. And one of them is Omar Harfuch, who's currently the head of public security of Mexico City. And we're expecting, everyone has their own perspective on this, but I think Claudia Sheinbaum is going to be the next president of Mexico, and he's either going to become the mayor of Mexico City or the head of public security. And he's named in the report. He was the head of the federal police in Guerrero when the 43 students. He tampered with the evidence. He participated in the cover-up, and yet he's still being rewarded and still a rising star within Mexico's political system. So this is the stuff that's really whoa, this is hard. This is hard to accept because it feels like it's a very, very difficult future. So, in sum, the López Obrador government has allowed the army to keep covering up its role, even though they campaigned on that. It's so high profile. It's the most high profile case in the last 20 years. They've also significantly expanded the army's role, and in exchange for what? It seems like in exchange for nothing. Like, the army has not agreed to become more democratic or have more civilian oversight or have any kind of meaningful checks and balance. Like, nothing. No concessions. No concessions. It brings, my question is always, who can say no to the army? And it feels like nobody can. So, very scary situation. I'm just going to end on resistance. So, feminist movements, family members of the disappeared, and migrants in Mexico, I think, are right now carrying some of the most inspiring resistance movements in the country. March 8th in Mexico City was huge, and it was all around the country and cities around the country, and feminists are increasingly positioning militarism as part of the patriarchy and part of what must be torn down. Right? So there's an increasing sort of activism on the part of feminists around militarism. And then migrants as well. I mean, migrants are probably the folks in Mexico that are living like the harshest social conditions, and yet they are still organizing and self-organizing. In Juarez, they've occupied 5 buildings, and they've taken them over and made them into self-run shelters because the government offers them no safety, and we know this because of the fire that happened, right? In March that killed 40 men in Ciudad Juarez. But I mean, they're still organizing caravans, they're demanding justice, etc. So it's not like there's no hope on the horizon. But for all the reasons that I've kind of shared, I feel like the perils of organizing in Mexico are about to become a lot more serious, and just increasingly so as the power of the armed forces continues to grow. And I'm going to leave it there.
Sarah. So we've listened to Don Marie Paley in the Latin American Perspectives lecture. I do want to remind those of you who are on YouTube that you can still watch this. It will remain in our page. We will not take Q&A live, but please send us any comments or questions to Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford. Next week, we will have Professor Gabriel Gatti, who will be talking on Friday, June 2nd, on his new book. And the talk is called Cartografiar ausencias, escribir y escuchar las nuevas desapariciones. So thank you very much.
Thank you.